Hi there, I'm Nicole Wilbur. I am a writer and story nerd, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I am talking about the story grid and where using the story grid went wrong for me when I was drafting my novel 1837. So if you've been around for a while, you know that last spring-ish I drafted a historical fiction novel called 1837 that I was not very happy with the result of. I have a video, it's called My Novel is a Disaster, it's all up there. Now, a big part of why I made so many mistakes with that novel was, I think, the process that I was following to write it. And I haven't talked yet kind of about the process that I was following. And I was actually using exclusively the story grid to draft that novel. Now, what is the story grid? For those of you who don't know, the story grid was a blog, and then a book, and then a podcast, and then an editor training camp, and then another podcast, and then another podcast, and then a publishing house. So the story grid is obviously very useful and helpful to a ton of people, including me. There is a lot of information in there, and I honestly can say that the story grid sincerely transformed my writing. I have been writing novels for a while. I guess the first one I wrote was I started in grade 8 when I was like 13, and then I revised a few times all through high school, and then you keep working, and each one did get a little bit better, but it was getting better like this. And then in 2018, two things happened. Number one, I read the story grid and started revising using the story grid. And number two, I started using Scribophile to get beta reader feedback. And at that point, there was like a little proof, like an inflection point in my writing progress where we stopped going kind of like little thing and we went, and then started going on like a inflection point, So the story grid, absolutely wonderful resource. And if you've never heard of it before, I'm going to attach a PDF below where I actually extracted a bunch of the links from the website. You can get a lot of the really good information just from the website without having to read any of the books. And I kind of put my favorites and where I would suggest starting in that PDF below. So do check that out. But in this video, I'm going to explain how the story grid went wrong for me, how I went wrong more when I was trying to use the story grid, so you can avoid those mistakes as well. So basically, the overall structure of the story grid that I was using, there are a lot of elements, but kind of what they call the 5 commandments of the story grid, and clearly if there's something called the 5 commandments, you should probably start there. So the 5 commandments of the story grid is basically that you need to have an inciting incident, a progressive complication turning point, a crisis, climax, and resolution in every story, in every act, and in every scene. And this breaks down into the story grid full scap, which is 4 acts with an inciting incident, progressive complication, turning point, crisis, climax, resolution in each one. And I will put the sort of template that I was using to outline my book up on the screen. Now, there's a whole lot more to the story grid. Some of their work in genre, which you also might think of as a plot archetype, is incredibly helpful, and I'm going to talk about that more later, as well as their suggestions for spreadsheeting. An actual story grid is like a graph that you create from the spreadsheet of the story. It gets very complex, and all those resources are below. But this is the main thing that I was focusing on using when I was outlining and drafting the first draft of my novel. While I was trying to use the story grid, which by the way was originally an analysis tool and I think has a lot of potential for editing, maybe not as much for like outline and first drafting, there were a lot of things that didn't quite go well, and I'm going to talk about them now. So first of all, this full scap that you see here is really a structure. It's not a plot, right? The plot has to come from elsewhere, and then the plot of your story, you want to make sure that you fit it into this kind of structure in story grid methodology, such that you have rising and falling action. I was only using this and their breakdown of a revolution story, so that's like a plot archetype, and it didn't work for me. It didn't help me come up with the actual plot of the story, if that makes sense. First of all, I don't think I'd read enough revolution stories at that point to be able to do well. And second of all, I didn't know my plot when I started to use the story grid. I didn't know we were doing this and this and this and this. And I tried to use this structure to help me plot the story. It was not a good tool to develop a plot. What it should feel like, I think, when you're plotting and when you're using a tool to plot is as you read it, you get ideas of, oh yes, and this, and this. It should be something that like is fueling your story. If it's a good plotting structure, it should feel like it's fueling your story and fueling your ideas. It shouldn't feel like something you have to fit your story to, if that makes sense. So for this, trying to plot with the story grid did not make sense. I needed a plot before I could do the story grid. And that led to the next problem, which was I really lost the through line of cause and effect. And the story grid methodology doesn't necessarily, in those tools that I was using, help the writer think through cause and effect, right? So it felt very episodic to me. So you have your inciting incident, right? You have a progressive complication turning point, so that turns where you are. A crisis, which is a character has to make a decision. Climax, the result of that decision. And resolution, the resolution of kind of the whole scene in that sequence. And so because I was trying to fit into this, okay, we have a decision here and then a resolution, and then the next act we're working towards another decision, and in the next act we're working towards another decision. Decision's really good for building character, for driving the story forward, for making sure you have an active character, absolutely valid. I just lost the cause and effect between each act of the story. You are supposed to have building and restoring in a story, but it all has to be connected and it all has to be fueled by this, by this, by this. And I will never forget, I sat down to try to do one of the Pixar's rules of storytelling. I could not make my story fit into that kind of cause and effect thing because the story grid didn't really prompt me, that methodology didn't prompt me to think, okay, what is fueling this? And didn't prompt me to make sure that everything was connected and was falling in dominoes, if that makes sense. Still a good methodology, but that was a bit where I found a hole and where my story struggled. The third thing that I found was difficult with story grid is that I find it really neglects character and very much neglects setting. At least the original book. I don't know about like future books and things like that. Like I wrote out what my characters wanted and the arc that I wanted them to have, but I didn't. But that was pretty much it. And I of course I had an idea for the characters in my head and I did some brainstorming around them and whatever, but it doesn't bring characters really into the methodology, like the base methodology of it, which is a problem because character is inherently connected to plot, right? And if I have my character arc, that arc, so say my character goes from, I don't know, being selfish to being altruistic or something, that's like their arc. The plot of that story has to be challenging the selfishness and has to be the cause of them undergoing that change, right? They have to be forced to kind of confront it so they can get over here. And at the same time, this selfishness is causing events in the story to happen, probably fueling the inciting incident. And then the inciting incident is making them become more selfish, and then becoming more selfish makes the next thing happen. And it kind of goes back and forth between those things. And setting as well really should influence the story and how things are all put together, right? Who said this? I think it might have been Brandon Sanderson. I've been listening to him a lot. Or maybe, no. There's this really great YouTube channel I recently discovered, and she put out a great video about how to write a good chapter. And what she said was, if you're going to have a town where there are ghosts, it's a normal town except there are ghosts, and the ghosts have to factor into the plot, right? All of those things has to be connected. And while I feel like Story Grid does a really good job of pulling on structure and sort of the fundamentals of what a story is, like that kind of base scaffolding, it doesn't do a good job of connecting the setting with the characters with the plot. And then the fourth thing that I really had trouble with here, I love how the Story Grid breaks down genre. They provide a lot of wonderful resources about like the overall structure of a love story, or the conventions in a revolution story, or the conventions in an action story. I actually don't love how they position their genre. I would say that the story grid genre is very much a plot archetype. And I love how Brandon Sanderson talks about plot archetypes. I highly recommend his videos as well. For me, understanding that genre is a plot archetype is a better name than genre. So if you have a love story, that could be a plot archetype. An action story or a revolution story or a heist story, those are all plot archetypes. Maybe story grid is a little like higher level than that. But the idea is that you can have multiple of these different plot archetypes in one story. Story grid kind of gets into it by calling it the global genre and the internal genre, but the truth is you can have like a global genre, an external subgenre, and like another genre, and just using the word genre kind of confuses me. Whereas I think if you think of it as a plot archetype and a plot thread, then it makes more sense. So hear me out here. So Brandon Sanderson says Mistborn is a heist story, a master apprentice story, and there's a love story in there. The Hunger Games has an action story, a love story, and a revolution story. The Princess Diaries is a performance plot archetype with a love plot archetype, as well as sort of a coming of age or worldview plot archetype. And then all of these have like little side characters in there as well. So for me, labeling one of these as global doesn't work. Like the Princess Diaries is the global story, a performance story where she has to come into herself as a princess, or is it a love story where she's falling in love with Michael, or is it a coming of age story because it's really about her sort of like development? And I think I could have done 1837 more justice if I'd plotted with threads versus trying to plot the overall story on one page. The problem with plotting the overall story on one page for me is that I really have two distinct threads in the story. There are two main characters, and each main character has a complete story for themselves, even though they also intermingle with each other's story and they all kind of go together. So trying to plot the two characters on one global foolscap was confusing for me. Whereas when I finally broke them out and made sure each one was an individual story and then worked on how they intermingled and went together, that worked a lot better. And I have a video on how I outlined like Brandon Sanderson by going through each plot archetype, each plot thread, and writing out exactly what happened, exactly how that progressed. So yes, there have to be global events where everyone comes together and all of the threads are intermingling. But in order to make sure that each thread was a complete story, I found it much more helpful to plot them out individually, because on that foolscap, I lost track of them. So, I've been talking about this a lot. Let's just boil it all down. Would I recommend the story grid to a friend? Yes, I would. Because A, most of the information is free on the website, which means you will get a lot of useful tools and resources that will likely give you something new to think about and another tool in your toolbox. However, what I learned from doing this, it is not a good idea to rely on just one methodology or just one craft book, because every writer will need a slightly different process and every book will need a slightly different process. So if you focus all of your attention kind of on, I'm going to learn this one resource, then what happens when that resource fails, when you hit the holes that I did, and then one resource is going to be perfect, and especially no one resource is going to be perfect for you. So I do suggest check out the story grid, read their resources. This is why I think AuthorTube is so great, because you learn so many things and hear about so many other people's processes. And even if you have your own process, there will come a point, I think, where you will get stuck and you will be like, I don't know what to do. What I usually do isn't working. And so it's great to have access to other ideas, other frameworks, other alternative ways of thinking about things, because for that specific story, for that specific writer, that might just be what they need in order to move forward. So the more tools in the toolbox, the better. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this kind of video, give it a thumbs up. And if you want to hear more from me, please click the subscribe button, because why not? Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.